So Tegan's based at the Queensland Herbarium and in biodiversity science at Des Ocean, and has been working with Australia's threatened flora and fauna for the past 7 years. This has included investigating nest predation of the endangered owl, golden-shouldered parrot on Ocala country, surveying the wet tropics flora for myrtle rust impacts, and co-authoring the first nationwide red list assessment of eucalypts and the 2021 action plan for Australia's imperilled plants. Tegan has been closely involved in threatened species listing and currently coordinates the threatened species assessment team, which prepares listing assessments for Queensland's endemic species. And her talk is about implementing the common assessment method, gold standard threatened flora assessments for Queensland. Thanks, Tegan.
Thank you. I'd just like to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the country we're on, the Yagara, Gayabul and Jarowair peoples, and special gratitude from me to the Jarowair people for looking after the country that I grew up on just north of here, north of Toowoomba. So today I'll be talking about the Threatened Species Assessment Program within QHBS, Queensland Herbarium and Biodiversity Science. So first let's start with some background. So threatened species lists are used to classify species according to their extinction risk. And this is one of the tools amongst others that we use to prioritise conservation resources to protect species from further declines. Other tools that should be factored in include things like community capacity. I think, Paul, you had a great example with the bunya bluegrass that you spoke about earlier, the likelihood of recovery, cost-benefit of actions, co-benefits to other species, and I believe Jane McDonald's presentation will elaborate a bit more on some of these things later in the week. Historically though, these threatened species lists in Australia have been confusing as they don't match between states and territories, and this is because each jurisdiction has different methods to classify their threatened species. So for example, some jurisdictions, like here in Queensland, we have historically assessed the whole distribution of a species, while other jurisdictions may only assess the part of that species distribution that occurs within their state. And this has meant a lot of duplication of effort that has led to confusion amongst the public. Okay. So to address this problem, the Commonwealth has been leading the implementation of a common assessment method. This involves a single assessment being prepared for each species. If they're endemic to a state, that state will lead the assessment for that species. If they occur across jurisdictions, the Commonwealth will lead those assessments. The aim is to arrive at a single consistent list of threatened species using the IUCN Red List categories and criteria. And this is all governed by a Memorandum of Understanding, which Queensland signed on to in 2017. And as of recently, all states and territories have actually signed on to it in Australia. So a brief overview of the IUCN criteria for those who are not familiar. Criterion A, backtrack, there are 5 criteria overall that we can use to assess whether a species is threatened or not, and they're lettered from A through to E. So criterion A is about population size reductions. Criterion B looks at very restricted distributions and if a species is declining. Criterion C looks at small population sizes that are declining. Criterion D looks at very small population sizes only. And criterion E involves estimating the extinction risk probability. So the categories are listed at the bottom there, and those that we call threatened are vulnerable, endangered and critically endangered, but oftentimes the near threatened and the extinct will get lumped into that term of threatened species. So shortly after we signed the CAM, the Common Assessment Method MOU in 2017, the Department's Threatened Species Program was audited, and the Audit Office found that we were listing species too slow and that there wasn't enough transparency in the way that we were doing our species assessments. The report made a number of recommendations, which included that DESI implement the Common Assessment Method for 366 species that were endemic to Queensland and were misaligned. So they had a different listing category between the Nature Conservation Act in Queensland and the EPBC Act at the federal level. And this is a photo of my team. My team received the funding to undertake this work in 2022. That's us on Teams because everyone's remote. Okay, so what's the process for listing a species? Firstly, we gather our species records and any data that we have, and then this gets vetted, the data gets cleaned, and then we map it. The next, we fill out our nomination form, and this includes a review of the threats, any other additional available data, and then we determine the eligible status for the species. This will then get sent to an expert or multiple experts for review. Finally, once the expert input has been taken on board, it will get sent to our Species Technical Committee, who are responsible for making a recommendation to our Minister. If the Minister approves the recommendations, the status will then get updated in our Nature Conservation Act regulations, which tends to happen about twice per year. The nomination will then get sent on to the Commonwealth, and then they have their own process. It's similar but with a few different steps for getting the nomination updated into the EPBC Act. Next. Okay, so given we had to write so many of these assessments, the first thing we did was write a practical manual that outlines exactly what a threatened species assessment in Queensland should look like. We then set up a process working group to oversee the implementation of a number of new systems and processes. This included a record cleaning process, and since we started the project, we have cleaned over 2,000 threatened species records, and we've updated the precision for over 500 of these. We also developed a script to standardise our mapping and a number of other templates and tools. So to determine the threats for each species, first my team would go to the published literature and our species experts. We also get sent some fantastic field survey reports from Brandon, who you'll hear from later in the week. We also rely heavily on many spatial information layers, so land use, vegetation mapping, Queensland fire scar mapping, and SLATs, which measures woody vegetation change. We also use our regional ecosystem description database that has recommendations for specific fire intervals for different vegetation communities, and also has metrics on the condition of those vegetation communities that the threatened species are closely associated with. All right, and now I'm just going to give an overview of some of the outcomes of the past 2 years' worth of work. So as of this September, we reached our 100% target. So we've completed all of the assessments, which is really exciting. Most of the assessments have been for flora, so 329 flora, and then 37 were for fauna. And so we'll just drill down into the plants for today, because we're all plant people here. Okay, so of the 329 plants, 180, so just over half, have been endorsed by our Species Technical Committee. So those are shown in yellow and green. 166 of these have then made it into our regulations, with an additional 14 ready to go with the next regulation update in 2025. So the most recent regulation update we had was very recently, just on the 1st of September. The STC can currently consider about 120 assessments per year, which is a mammoth amount. And given this, they will probably get through the last of our work from this tranche by December 2025. Okay, and so if we look at the 180 species that have been endorsed by the STC, there's been a little bit of movement and change in status. So most species have had no change in status, so 81 in yellow. 31 have been downlisted, so transferred to a lower status, but 68 have been uplisted. And if we drill down into the 68 that have been uplisted, climate change is the key threat for 31% of these, followed by introduced invertebrates for 27% of these. And so for the species uplisted due to climate change, 21 of these were due to montane drying in the high elevation habitats of the wet tropics. And this research here is drawing upon research that Darren touched on earlier in his talk. So this is an example of Cinnamonum propinquum. It's known from 2 mountaintops in the wet tropics, very high elevation. Its current suitable habitat is shown in dark blue. That contracts to the light blue area by 2035, and then to the red area, which you can't see because it's not there, in 2085. And so for this species, we were able to infer a decline in habitat quality, and it was uplisted from vulnerable to critically endangered under criterion B. There were 18 species uplisted due to feral pigs, mostly occurring in alluvial soils in the wet tropics and Cape York. So generally what we found was that larger trees would experience declines due to impacts on their seedlings, which would stifle recruitment. And then for smaller plants such as herbs and orchids, the impacts were direct destruction of the adult plants. So that's Citrus inodora pictured there. Feral pigs eat the fruit of that plant, and when they eat it, they actually crush the seeds up. So that reduces the number of plants that are able to recruit into the next generation, and so we were able to uplist that species from vulnerable to endangered. This is a note on data deficiency. So many of the flora we assess have limited or no data beyond their original collections. Those that haven't been collected in more than 20 years or 3 generations with no current information on population size are generally considered by our STC to be data deficient. However, in our regulations, we don't have this category, but the Red List guidelines do state that you can use inferential and anecdotal data to make a listing decision. So for example, this is Crudia papuana. It's a tree known from 4 sites up near Bamaga, so that's far north Queensland, up in the Cape. It hasn't been collected since 1980, so that's over 40 years. There's no site-based or census data available, but we do know that feral pigs cause extensive damage in the areas where it lives, as shown in the photo. And there are several studies that show generally that this kind of damage will limit recruitment. So from this information, we were able to infer a decline in habitat quality for this species and uplist it from vulnerable to critically endangered. The guidelines also state that assessors should take a precautionary rather than evidentiary approach, and for our STC, this generally means that they would rather list something using inference or suspicion and then delist it and delist it later when further information comes available, rather than waiting to have quantitative evidence and leaving it unlisted. Okay, so this graph shows the number of species in each of the listed categories, but from before the project started in blue to where we are now in orange. The critically endangered category has gone from 0 to 139. That's because it was only added in 2020. We didn't have critically endangered prior to then. Critically endangered, endangered and near threatened are all going up. Vulnerable is going down. The number of extinct species is also going down. And that in this case, this is because the standard of evidence has changed. So previously, if a species was not seen for 50 years, it would generally be listed as extinct. But now there needs to be surveys undertaken in all known habitat at appropriate times for the species. So for this Tylotus, it hasn't been seen since 1967, but based on Jen Silcock's paper, they found that only 50% of the suitable habitat had been searched. So for this species, we actually returned it back to critically endangered until further surveys are undertaken. So in terms of what's next, our team has received ongoing funding to continue this threatened species listing work. We're really over the hill now, so we've done that first tranche there, that 366. And next we're going to focus on endemic species that aren't listed but are likely to be threatened. Then we will take a look at species that are listed as endangered and could be eligible for that higher category, but they might not have been looked at since that category was introduced in 2020. And then we'll have a look at our near threatened species that might be eligible for a higher category. We're also starting to summarise all of the data out of these assessments, so pulling all the key metrics out so that we can analyse the trends over time. And we're starting to look at developing a standardised flora survey method that will help get some of that consistency that we need for time series monitoring in terms of how we actually undertake the survey so that they can be compared over time. And we're hoping that this will be used by other collaborators such as, First Nations ranger groups, other community groups, and so that information can then be fed back into assessments and we can increase the level of data that we have available in those. And this is my team. They won a DESI Excellence Award, which I'm really proud of. And yeah, just a massive thank you to them. And then everyone's name who's contributed to nominations is listed down the bottom there. Thanks.
Thanks, Tegan. Very encouraging that you've got funding continuing. All we need now is your conservation seed bank in Queensland.